exchange between the two. And so it's really exciting. And thanks to everyone who's here as well for listening to talk about the book. We wrote the book over the years, and we did fieldwork in 2019, and we have to say it's, it felt very, I guess, very tiring for often to be talking about these issues when we started. And I guess that what is more sad over time is that the stories that we will hear about are maybe more relevant today than they were in 2019 when we talked to these people, and they were already very, very, very important. So I think I'm just thinking about the context and thinking about where we are right now, and it's important and interesting. So I'm going to be sharing some extracts from the book, and we're going to be presenting from the two of us. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the book, but I'm going to be reading some stories. So, oops, can you? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Okay, so Olivia lived close to the metro in Ecatepec in northeastern Mexico City. She rented a room rather than an apartment in order to save money to purchase her own home. When she had worked long enough, she would apply for a mortgage through the National Home Loans Program for workers. That way, she would have a place in the city where all of her children could gather together. Evaristo gave us a ride to the Revolucion metro station from the cafe where we met in Santa Maria la Ribera in central Mexico City. Driving for Uber is better than driving a cab, safer. But you can't use the Uber app for directions. You have to use Waze, he told us. He made a last-minute turn onto a side street to avoid an approaching traffic jam. But even with Waze, he said, you have to know how to navigate the city. Olivia and Evaristo and the other people we interviewed blend into the landscape of contemporary Mexico City. And I don't know how many of you have been to Mexico City, but they walk its streets, shop its markets, meet their friends for lunch, read local newspapers, and go to church. They rent rooms, they own houses there, they provide essential services in travel, cleaning, restaurants, and retail to customers in the city. They vote in Mexican elections, so they're Mexican nationals. And although they are part of this social landscape of Mexico City, the people we interviewed share something hard for others in the city to see. Like it is true that, it's a very different reality when you think about these people in Mexico City and other contexts. When we met them in 2019, they had all recently returned from long periods of residence in the United States. So, for example, Olivia owned a home in Denver. Evaristo has 6 US-born grandchildren. And although they once made their lives in the United States, and many of the family members could continue to do so, their current and future lives unfold back in Mexico. What's interesting is that, for Olivia and Evaristo, they are not alone, and they are 6, well, there are 2 of, we recover 6 stories in the beginning of the book, but these 2 people actually are one of the 2 million Mexican migrants who returned to Mexico from the United States in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. And the number of people who returned to Mexico in this period was actually so large that for the first time in at least 50 years, the more people entered Mexico from the United States than entered the United States to Mexico. And this period, we're already 15 years past, but this decade really marked a kind of like a reversal of the trend of what we have been seeing. And as a result, the undocumented Mexican-born population in the US declined from a peak of almost 7 million in 2005 to around 4 million in 2022. And we can discuss how this changed in the last few years as well. So Mexican migrants used to be the majority of the undocumented population. And now, as a result of this return migration flow, they make up just over a third. So this will be interesting and important to think about as well. So in the return, and I have to say, Nicole Denier is online, so our third author is there. But in the book we study this recent transformation of Mexico-U.S. migration we discussed this through the life stories of 34 migrants that are based in Mexico City. So in case you don't know where the metropolitan area of Mexico City is, we show it here in the map. It's really interesting that Mexico City is, the capital. It's one of the largest metropolitan areas of the world. And it's important to think as well that its massive size of 20 million inhabitants is a product of massive domestic migration in the 20th century. So Mexico City its role as a destination for internal migrants shifted over in the 1980s and 1990s, when actually the northern border became more attractive for manufacturing work. But as the destinations of domestic migrants changed, the origins of international migrants changed as well, right? And so by the 1990s, a majority of first-time immigrants from Mexico to the US actually originated from urban areas and places like Mexico City. And this is something that sometimes goes unaware in what we study of Mexican migration. Between 1995 and 2000, nearly 1 out of every 10 immigrants departing from Mexico to the US actually originated from Mexico City, from the metropolitan area. And of course, this flow included Olivia and Evaristo and the other migrants we talked to. By 1990, most Mexican migrants to the US actually did not originate in large Mexican cities, but in rural places. So this was before, but then we have this shift as well as in tandem to the shift that we see in Mexico, in the Mexico City population. So there is an assumption today in Mexico, in many of the studies, that the migrant from Mexico City, from Mexico in the US is from rural origin. And actually, for example, the barber Paolo actually told us about how, in this interaction with people in the border, there is also this assumption, right? So he said, where do you come from? One says, I come from Guadalajara. I said, no, well, I am from the city. Oye, un chilanguillo. He says, why do you, and this is like a name for the people originated from Mexico City, from Chilango. He says, why do you cross the border if you don't seem so jodido? No, well, I want to cross, no? But they're in the federal district, or that's the old name for Mexico City, or Distrito Federal. It says, there are more opportunities. I don't know why you're crossing, they would comment. And the other migrants that Paolo encountered on the border teased him for being from Mexico City, right? By saying a chilanguillo. But they could not believe that Paolo would actually cross the border if he came from the capital city, right? There's this disconnect of finding more opportunities. And by contrast, the cultural image of the Mexican migrants having been from a rural origin, lacking resources, is also something that is often assumed in Mexico. So not only in the US as well, right? So in many ways, the population that we study, the Mexico City immigrant, is a cultural contradiction, surprising to other migrants at the border. And what's interesting is that back in Mexico City, the returned migrant is invisible in this large, vast urban social environment. And this is actually kind of like the result of what Raul expressed, another returnee, by saying, well, people do not know where you come from or who you are, and they treat you just as they treat everyone in the neighborhood. As a random person, you run into the metro, you will not start screaming, hey, I'm a migrant. So this is quite different from the story that has been told about return migration to rural places. Where in tight-knit communities of small towns or ranchos, in the traditional area, specifically in Western Mexico, migrants are known by those left behind. Their houses are visible. You can see physically how the space changes when they send remittances, and people again build the houses, or they drive different trucks, and the clothes or the shoes that they wear, right? Migrants from small towns and rural communities kind of like transform their communities of origin, sending money, supporting their families, constructing homes, or investing in new projects. And often migrants would bring fresh ideas and modes of being. They would interact in new ways with the family and community members. They would energize politics. And there has been lots of studies that have documented these sorts of changes in rural Mexico. And often it is argued that Mexican migration and return would actually engage the community in development or modernization in places where, otherwise removed from those processes, we would think that these processes were already unfolding in Mexican cities. So really, like in our study, what we ask is like, what does it mean to be a return migrant to Mexico City? Just very quickly, we do talk a lot in the book about the border, where you have and we can discuss that later, different degree of visibility, right? But in rural places, definitely, people were kind of like missed upon immigration.
So there were disadvantages and advantages to this Mexico City specific experience of being relatively invisible as a former migrant. But one of the disadvantages for us as researchers was finding return migrants or former US migrants in Mexico City to talk to. So we tried a lot of different ways to identify and recruit former US migrants in the city, approaching people in places like the Monumento a la Revolución, there shown there in the photo on the left, call centers that employ English-speaking returnees. But ultimately, we found a lot of respondents through our personal networks and the friends and the family of the people that we interviewed. And we traveled through the city to the far north, which is shown at the top picture, and to the far southeast to conduct interviews. And here's a map showing where our participants were located throughout the city of Mexico. And just to give you a sense of the scale of the city, it would take 3 hours to travel from the southernmost interview to the northernmost interview. And from the center of the city where we were located to the southeastern point in the Valle de Chalco, it would take an hour on the subway, on the train, metro. And the official limits of the metropolitan area of Mexico City cover nearly 8,000 square kilometers, which is just slightly smaller than the island of Puerto Rico. We had intended to conduct more than 34 interviews, but the pandemic introduced health and safety concerns for fieldwork, as well as concerns that people's experiences were dramatically changed under the forces of the pandemic. So in 2020, our team started meeting on Zoom to analyze our data of 34 interviews. And shown here is one of our meetings with a team of research assistants that were funded through the UC Mexico Alianza, which was called UC Mexico when we got our grant. And Francisco Flores, who is has his hands behind his head, and Gabriela Pinillos in the bottom have written with the data. Isha on the top right has also written with the data, including in our book. So that's just a very brief introduction to some of the methods of our analysis, and I'll tell you a little bit about our data. So our interviewees, the people we spoke to, these former US migrants living in Mexico City, migrated to the United States in a particular point in their own lives, as well as in the history of these two countries. And we try to illustrate that in this figure here, which shows the life and migration trajectories of each of the 34 people we spoke to. So each row represents a single life course, with light shaded blocks representing years lived in Mexico and dark shaded blocks representing years lived in the United States. So if you focus on a single row, like the one I just highlighted, which is number 13, we have a person who was born in 1974. They migrated to the United States in 1990 at the age of 16. They lived in the United States for 26 years, returning to Mexico in 2016 when they were 42. And they had been back in Mexico for about 3 years when we interviewed them. And so these are the we collected qualitative data about each of these experiences and points of these people's lives. The trajectory I just showed you is fairly typical for a couple of reasons. Most of the people we spoke to migrated to the United States in the 1990s, which is when the highest levels of Mexico-US migration have been observed in the last 100 years. And indeed the very highest level counted of people who immigrated from Mexico to the United States in a single year was in the year 2000. The people we spoke to lived in the United States for an average of 11 years. This is also typical of people who did not live in citizen status, non-citizen people in the United States. Most of the people we spoke to were undocumented. They returned to Mexico after 2007, which is when that return migration flow that Claudia mentioned began and shifted net migration rates to negative. This historical period in which these people migrated was characterized by a U.S. government response to Mexico-U.S. migration that did not accommodate migrants with visas and with support, but instead attacked the problem with increasing efforts to control and restrict the mobility of migrants and the rights of migrants in the United States. And in the book, we call this period the policy trap. And for the remainder of our talk, we're going to tell you a little bit of the lessons that we learned from the people who we spoke to about their experiences living in the United States during the policy trap, migrating there, living there, returning to Mexico, and what it's like to reintegrate into Mexico after having been in the US. One of the big lessons of the book is that the policy trap had profound impacts on the lives of immigrants in the United States during their times there, but also after they returned to Mexico. And I'm going to tell you Olivia's story to reveal some of how this might look in a single person's life. So Olivia, her husband Rodrigo, and their young daughter migrated to Arizona in the early 2000s. Rodrigo found good work as a dishwasher, and Olivia stayed home with their daughter, occasionally cleaning houses for some income. They had 3 more children in Arizona, and they were very successful economically. But after Arizona passed the Senate Bill 1070, or the Show Me Your Papers law, they moved to Colorado. So they fled heightened enforcement and the threat of apprehension in Arizona, but it was in Colorado where Olivia's life as an immigrant in the United States began to unravel. In 2013, she was caught driving without a license, and she was detained for 4 months during deportation proceedings. But Olivia was not deported at that time. She qualified for a narrow form of immigration relief and successfully argued in the courts that she should be issued a stay because of her using the language of the law, her good moral conduct, her record of tax payments, her clean criminal record, and most importantly, the extreme hardship to her disabled US-born daughter if she were deported. The judge agreed and granted her discretionary status to defer her deportation and grant her work authorization. So Olivia's work authorization enabled her to start her own successful cleaning business, but under her discretionary status, she was required to check in annually with immigration agents. She told us that in 2016, her lawyer gave her the following advice. Quote, if Trump ends up being president the first time, there will be a lot of changes because he comes with a very different ideology. There's a risk that he could deport you. Do you want to risk it, or do you want to hide? Disappear from the map so that there's no problem. So Olivia, her lawyer, was suggesting that she might not show up for a check-in. But if she did that, she would lose her work authorization. And she didn't want to lose her successful business, so she decided to risk it. And in April 2017, when she showed up for her annual migration check-in, she was arrested, detained, and deported. Olivia and her family were subject to the policy trap. This period in U.S. immigration policy began in 1986 when the U.S. government passed the Immigration Reform and Control Act. In addition to an amnesty for long-term undocumented immigrants residing in the United States, IRCA began a period of intensive immigration enforcement control at the border. And then following the passage of laws like the 1996 Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, and policies like the 287G program, we saw increasing efforts to apprehend and detain immigrants in the interior of the country. We use the word trap to describe this immigration regime because it captures the experience of the people we spoke to who were trapped in the United States during their stays here. They frequently wanted to return to Mexico to visit family, but they could not because of the cost of re-entry to the United States. As a result, they reunited with and formed new families in the United States rather than living a transnational life. They lost connections with friends and family and employers in Mexico and settled in the United States. It's also a trap because the laws that were passed during this period failed to accommodate the migrants we spoke to. So here's the same graph we saw earlier, but now we see a vertical purple line that indicates the year in which undocumented residents in the United States had to have entered the US in order to qualify for the IRCA amnesty. And one of our respondents in row 7 who entered at age 5 in the 1960s, qualified for that relief and was later deported after criminal conviction. The other major expansion of, let's say, expansion of immigrant rights in this period was the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, but none of our respondents qualified for that program either. So to be eligible for DACA, a person had to be born after 1981, which is after that purple bar. They also had to have migrated to the United States prior to age 16, which is marked in light blue, and have continuously resided in the United States from 2007 to 2012. And none of the migrants in our sample met these narrow criteria. So this graph reveals the arbitrariness and complexity of the DACA eligibility criteria when applied to real lives among people who participated in large-scale migration to the United States in the 1990s and early 2000s. So the people we interviewed lacked full rights to live and work in the United States, but they nevertheless had well-paying jobs, raised children, and became members of their communities. It still, as we know, these policies had a deep impact on them. So as Olivia described it, you live with fear. People who have documents don't worry that migration authorities are going to grab you. Again, this is speaking in 2019. Or that you will be left without work because someone asks you for your documents. But people without documents are always aware that something can happen. And so in the wake of this experience of fear in the United States, return to Mexico, even in the case of Olivia's deportation, introduced a real experience of renewed freedom. I am here and I love my country. I love to walk on the streets without the fear that migration agents will grab me, because here I know that if I don't get into trouble, then I don't have any reason to think that I will be persecuted by the law. And this feeling of relief, of freedom from persecution, was found among nearly every single person we spoke to, including people who returned for a variety of different reasons. And yet, while experiencing freedom in Mexico, there was still an experience of being trapped. So Olivia could not return to the United States. She was given a 10-year bar on reentry. She says, imagine 10 years without seeing my children. You know, you cannot wait 10 years, but you also know that if you go, you risk that they detain you and you spend 2 years in prison. I feel like I'm at the top of a mountain, Everest, and behind me, there's a pack of wolves, and in front of me is the precipice. What do? Do you jump? Surely you'll die, but if you turn around, the wolves prey.
So, I mean, in our book, we really focus on what it means to go back and settle back in the city, right? And I'm going to read the beginning of chapter 4. Evaristo was born in Michoacan, but moved to Mexico City with his family when he was a baby. In his mid-20s, he and his wife and children traveled to the United States on tourist visas to visit his siblings and mother. He lived in the Midwest, but his plans unexpectedly changed after they arrived. I got there and they told me that my mother has terminal cancer. The doctor told us she has 3 to 6 months to live, no more. Well, I said, I can just stay on vacation. Evaristo's extended stay eventually turned into settlement. He found work and his kids enrolled in school. He lived in the United States for nearly 20 years. He told us about Thanksgiving dinners and Halloween parties, trips to Miami and Disneyland, and time spent on the lake close to their home during the summers. In 2017, he arrived alone in Mexico City, fleeing the threat of incarceration and deportation. Evaristo's arrival in Mexico City was sudden and unplanned, but he was able to bring some money with him. He purchased a car and started his own business in Mexico City as an Uber driver. He managed the construction of his family home in a Mexico City suburb, financed by remittances sent by his brothers. Although Evaristo was fortunate to arrive with some financial stability, the experience was extraordinarily difficult. He sympathized with the experiences of other less fortunate return migrants. How do they go? Walking towards where? North or south? Where is north and where is south? They arrive norteados and no one helps them. So as we actually explain in the introduction of the book and throughout the different chapters, the notion of norteado has two meanings. So on the one hand, the Spanish word means being disoriented or lost in space, but it also makes a reference to the north, as if returnees are still there here in the United States, and are northless in Mexico. And we think that norteado captures the simultaneous experience of disorientation and loss upon return to the city. US migrants are disoriented in many ways upon return to Mexico City, and most basically they are overwhelmed and lost in this massive, complex, ever-changing landscape of Mexico City, of the metropolis itself. They're also disoriented socially, disconnected from the family and old friends as a result of their absence in the city. And the disorientation is actually worse because their status as a return migrant grants them few social advantages, and they discuss in the book. At best, their immigration to and return from the United States is an invisible status in the city, and we also discuss if this is an actually advantage, but they are actually stigmatized for their US style or presumption of criminality. But however, I mean, like over time, they do settle into life in Mexico City. And we actually, I mean, one of the chapters focuses on what happens in terms of the work and labor market experiences. We also take the story of Mario, who, as an agricultural worker in the United States, he mastered the intricacies of multiple harvests, onions, 5 varieties of apples, cherries, asparagus, broccoli, and carrots. And for almost 20 years, he learned the knives, which knives were appropriate for which crops, how to protect his hands from vines, roots, tools, and other hazards, and how much he needed to do to make good money on each fruit or vegetable. And although Mario became a skilled farm worker in the United States, his pathway into agriculture was not assured. So he's a native of Puebla, and he was raised in Veracruz. He joined an older brother in Mexico City as a teenager after finishing some high school. His brother got him a job in a sheet metal factory, which he left for work in a garment factory. He then joined the transport unit of the army, which offered much higher pay. And over the next 10 years or so, the military took him to different parts of the country. He married, he had children. But when he was discharged, he worked as a driver at a mirror factory. By age 35, he had considerable experience in manufacturing and transport and had secured formal work in the military and various private factories. At 35, Mario and his wife decided to cross into the United States to join his sister, and they left their children and a grandparent. So when Mario arrived in the new home, he could find only one job, right? Harvesting asparagus. So he took it, and then he switched to cherries. He discovered kind of like the different pros and cons of each crop, the different health risks and payoffs. And he would continue until he worked with 6 different fruits and vegetables. He then, his pay allowed him to buy a mobile home and a car. He supported his children, who arrived 2 years after him. He weathered the divorce from his wife. And then he was deported age 55, again, 20 years after he arrived. One of the daughters by then was already an adult, tried to salvage his belongings, but in the end, he arrived in Mexico City with almost nothing. So after 20 years in the United States, 40 years after he first migrated to Mexico City at age 15, he had to start anew. Unlike in the US, where the only job he could find was in agriculture, in Mexico City, he survived by working in a series of service jobs that he strung together. And none of the transportation jobs he applied for were interested in him. He was too old. His experience in transportation was too long ago. And of course, his agriculture experience in the United States could not be transferred to the city, right? So he says, I like being a chauffeur, but for that, I would have to get back my papers of being a chauffeur. I have not been able to recover my certificate or discharge from the army. If I go look for a job that serves as a reference or that proves I was a driver, that I have experience. And although he really dreamt to become a chauffeur, drawing on his long history in Mexico and transportation, he had really issues proving his experience as a chauffeur. This difficulty was widely shared among returnees. People experience discrimination because of age, gender, disability, language skills, or stereotypes that migrants were criminals, for example. And many, like Mario, also had issues revalidating their studies or having their work experiences and skills recognized. And in Mexico, I don't know how many you're aware of, but there is a very important emphasis on formal documentation and credentials and really proving like in paper that you have done everything you have done. So this is really a challenge for those who return. So in this context, many people actually, could not find jobs quickly. They strategized to support themselves and their families, and many actually engaged in survival employment for this. Some people like Mario took informal work in the service sectors. Others started small informal businesses. They would sell handicrafts, especially for the case of women. Others actually kind of like joined together to work with migrant serving organizations or with businesses that actually targeted the unique skill of returnees, like English language call centers or tour companies. But very few people who we interviewed actually were able to successfully start a business or provide themselves with stable income. More than anything, they didn't really find them as fulfilling in general. And some of these successes were predicated on having maintained some social networks in Mexico City. They could actually be incorporated into other businesses. But even fewer were able to build on their migration experience or even mobilize new skills to actually succeed. And actually, so for the majority of the people we talked to, the experience of return really involved downward mobility. So as you can see here in the table, compare the types of work people did prior to migrating in the US, to the US, in the US, and then once back in Mexico City. Many people, just like Mario, did not experience upward mobility. Many people developed skills in the US. They worked on essential jobs like agricultural, construction, manufacturing, or care work. But upon return, they took jobs that many found less ideal without being able to transfer their skills. So in general, we find that actually a younger returnee, for example, Julio, who we talked to, he was 26 when we talked to him, and he said, my idea of return brutally changed. My idea was to return to my country of origin, and I thought that the rejection that I felt in the US from not being able to work at a McDonald's because I was undocumented would never happen here. I thought, here I will achieve it, and it was not like that. So for Julio, Mario, and many others, actually, this feeling of disappointment with the opportunities in Mexico or loss compared to what they actually achieved in the US meant that many felt that they were not doing jobs that they found adequate. And these disappointments and feelings of loss actually kind of like overshadowed even the successes that they actually found in Mexico City. So in the last chapter of the book, we actually, it's called, again, like reorienting the compass. When Evaristo said, where is north and where is south? or they arrive norteados and no one helps them, we are reminded of a compass that is oriented towards a specific geographic direction, right? And compasses use a pivot that points to the magnetic north. It's used for navigation. And we now use GPS and other methods to orient ourselves and navigate through space. But compasses and GPS are not useful to returnees who are, again, disoriented socially and by the experience of US migration. So in the absence of these easy tools, as well as in the absence of the family and significant state support, returnees actually created or joined organizations as a way to find and provide support to each other. And actually in this chapter, we include a series of reflections that the migrants themselves tell us on how their life could be better in different ways. And I mean, I have to say a few things. So I would say that some of the suggestions are kind of simple in terms of how their lives could improve. There is no one policy that would address everyone's needs. They also speak to how it would be nice to incorporate the community, not only the returnees or not only necessarily like the government, on different ways to avoid stigma, discrimination, or even generalizing the experiences of those who come back. And also just like having kind of like more comprehensive immigration reform, of course, and I mean, going through the policy trap, right? And being able to meet again with their family. We also have a discussion at the end of the book on what it means, for example, to kind of like add return migration to the equation and think about integration into new contexts, what it means for integration and adaptation and assimilation theory, for transnationalism, and just like kind of like bringing the idea that we need to consider kind of like the whole trajectory, the migrant trajectory, and what it means to be back in Mexico City. In many ways, we find that our data, like when you see the stories, that many of the processes are actually fall on what we already know in terms of theory and concepts, but in many other ways, actually the concepts are actually question, right? So for some returnees, actually going to Mexico City is a return home. Sometimes people do reunite with their families and they celebrate these goals, but for many others, their home will still be in the United States. They have lives like aquí, allá in both places, and their lives actually kind of like unfolds in both sides of the border. So we hope you read the book now, but we really, we want to thank of course, the people who shared their stories with us, and again, you for hosting, and all the 4 centers for with different acronyms for actually inviting us. And yeah, we're really happy to share the stories and also answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll take questions in the room as well as from folks on Zoom. If folks on Zoom have a question, feel free to raise your hand on Zoom or post your question in the chat. Would anyone in the room like to chat?
So I do not understand. Most of the people who return, they are deported, or some of them they return by themselves?
Excellent question.
Yeah. And on purpose.
Well, I was thinking we should have said that. So, in our data of 34 people, half were deported and half returned for other reasons. However, that's not representative of return migrants in Mexico City, among whom a minority are deported. And so we did get, we spoke to more people who were deported, partly because of our interest in understanding deportation and how it is similar or different from migration for other reasons. And, you know, one of the arguments that emerges in the book is that it's less, in the case of these people in Mexico City, less different than you might expect. But we also were recruiting among organizations that served people who'd been deported specifically, and so had a work. It was easier to find people who'd been deported and find people who'd been in the United States and returned for other reasons. We were also interested in people who'd returned after being in the United States in irregular status. So a large number former migrants in Mexico City, if you look at, certain large scale survey or census data, were in the US on a visa, or have a green card to go back and forth. And we weren't interested in those experiences as much as in the experience of the people who've been really subject to the harms of this immigration regime that characterized the period.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, I said like we didn't say that on purpose because I do think that regardless of deportation, the policy trap really traps migrants, well, foreign-born immigrants in the US. And it also traps them in Mexico, back in Mexico. And I think this is what is kind of like new in thinking what the policy trap means upon return. So even if they were not deported, the people we talked to that actually didn't go through this process, they still were subject to the policy trap in the sense that because they had an undocumented status in the US, they were not eligible to go back and like legally and access to documents, and like there were like no legal options for them, right? So when you look at the population in Mexico City that returned, of course, our sample, for example, would be, I mean, it does not include many of like high school migrants that would come and study here at UC, like at the UC system and then go back to Mexico. But they always had like legal documents in the US, right? So it is also not representative of the return migrant population in Mexico City, but it is talking to this population that had an irregular status in the US and is back in Mexico, regardless of deportation.
It asked because if you're deported, you're not prepared to go back. So what the work they're going to do. But if they want to open business, they need money, but for deported, they were not prepared. But is there some people who really plan to go back, have some money, start some business there? Or very few?
In our data, there were really no one who fit that storyline of someone who planned to return to begin a business. One person returned and did end up in a very successful family business, running a successful family business. But they basically left the US during the recession. And so it wasn't, their time in the US didn't really relate to their business formation in Mexico. It was more like, okay, we can go back and work in this business because things aren't going well here or in the US. The other thing that was interesting among the people we spoke to who were not deported was the lack of preparedness many of them experienced around return. So a significant portion of those 17 migrants returned under what we would say are kind of quasi-forced circumstances. So some of them migrated because a family member was deported and they accompanied that family member. Others experienced a death in the family and returned to Mexico, or a health crisis and returned to Mexico, and then found themselves unable to re-enter the United States. So not experiencing the force of the US government and the experience of detention and those kinds of significant harms and traumas, but still experienced a very kind of sudden and unprepared return.
So we have a question from Zoom, Emily Lopez. Would you like to read your question, Emily? I'm not sure if she's available, but she said, would you say that migrants generally have a better experience on the socioeconomic level in the US or in Mexico City? Since Evaristo says he does not.
That's an interesting question.
Hi, I think in general, we saw downward mobility, and because migrants have spent so long periods in the US and they were settled, they actually talk a lot about the different assets that they had. I mean, I don't know, you have to think that they integrated into US society, had children born in the US. They many had businesses here, they were working, they owned a car. they have older things, like, I mean, we have a discussion of Evaristos, like skis, and just like, I don't know, like people actually were living a life here, and they had experienced often upward social mobility and settlement. So of course, in Mexico, it is difficult in many different levels, right? So in general, yeah, we do see that more mobility back in Mexico.
But I'll add that some of them who acknowledge that commented on quality of life in a way that reflected a real preference to be back in Mexico. So the feeling that the U.S. culture is one of work, constant work, and kind of focus on income earning, and that their experience had been particularly that way, just a lot of hard, long hours of work, that it's a very isolating experience and culture. So not just of being an immigrant, but of, people not being in communal settings and in community with one another in the US. And so although many say things like, yeah, I mean, I live with fewer dollars here or something, or, with less money, but I am happy here. My soul is more happy because of the escape. And often this was in conversation around, the escape from that experience of persecution, which many of them commented on feeling that sense of relief on return to Mexico. And then also experience kind of that like culture of money, of like really what life is about is earning. And that felt very oppressive to many people.
And I guess there were other things that were important, right? So whether they were coming back with family members or not, if they were separated from the children, from grandchildren. So actually, so in the question they mentioned Evaristo, and Evaristo is the one who tells us about Norteado, but Evaristo also discusses a lot about how people need to learn to navigate the city, and we have a lot of discussion about actually like physically moving in the city, and we have actually a discussion as well on how age disability affects movement. And so, for example, we have the story of a returnee who was he was training on a wheelchair here in the US, and then back in Mexico, he finds very hard to move around because the infrastructure does not allow him and to move. And so it's not only like going back to the experience on the socioeconomic level. I think it just like touches other things that are related. And so navigating the city means going to work, but also going to school, but also like you making use of public transportation and moving around. And I think that for the returnees, this many of them, this is actually like an issue for different reasons. And specifically, we don't think that, in this sense, like deportation is the kind of like the axis that would explain all these differences, because even those who came back kind of like forced after a health crisis or an accident, upon return, they again feel this need for moving around and for finding a job and for integrating back to Mexico. And so you could say it wasn't planned, but at the same time, it's not only because of their legal status in the US.
Andrea, would you like to read your question aloud?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yes.
Cool. So first of all, thank you. This was a really interesting presentation, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. I wanted to ask, like you talked about at some point, like this kind of paradox between returnees experiencing greater freedom from persecution as compared to the US, but also continuing to feel trapped in Mexico. And I wanted to see if you could talk more about that. Perhaps I missed it. I just want a bit more details on like that particular point. And also how this kind of like freedom constraint dynamic, what it means for like broader theories of migration. I know kind of at the end of the presentation, you mentioned like your contributions to like these broader theoretical frameworks. And I just wanted to know more about like your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, this paradox, as we call it, of feeling free upon return to Mexico, but also feeling trapped, is it's something that emerged in the data that we didn't anticipate or ask about, but was so pervasive in our interviews that we, of course, had to write about it. And I think it's a real reflection of the policy trap or the constraints that the U.S. government has placed on mobility and on human rights in the case of immigrants, and in particular this migration flow that we studied. So the human impact of that is the one that of this paradox of having lived in a context where you're in fear and fear walking on the street for being persecuted. Some of the men we spoke to talked about how they felt disempowered and in speaking with kind of representatives of other important people like a landlord or an employer or something, because they just felt like they didn't have the right to do that, and that was something that power came back when returning to Mexico. And so and we asked about like the experience of getting their citizenship documents, electoral card and things like that, and they're like, oh, and then I was mistreated in this place, but at least I could speak up about it, or like, they told me that maybe if I could get a quicker thing with a little whatever, cash payment, and I did this, or there wasn't an elevator there and I was annoyed and I could at least express that annoyance. And so, yeah, I mean, it's, I think I'll stop there. Claudia has done a lot of thinking about integration theories, and I guess it speaks to in thinking about return, there's all kinds of questions that are raised about theories that were developed with kind of a single directional permanent migration in mind, and when you return to a place where you have citizenship and you grew up and you may still have family and networks and so on, it's a very different question of integration. And I think the paradox that we describe in the book just reveals that that's shaped by national policies and policies of the receiving country, as well as of what you might expect to be important in the country of origin in terms of like the state of policies and programs for returnees or for work or for disability or whatever.
I mean, I would add that two things. So we also have a discussion on how Mexico City is also a violent city, and it's interesting for them also to kind of like re-encounter the city in terms of how it feels like, whether you feel safer or not in Mexico City's neighborhoods. I mean, some come from very violent places in the US, but they would still think that so this fear is not only coming from immigration agents, it could also be coming from gangs, both in the US and Mexico, and feeling safe or unsafe. There's also like a discussion in terms of how they feel kind of like surprised about corruption in Mexico, for example, in Mexico City. And so in terms of theory, for example, like it is really interesting because when you think about, I don't know, political integration or political participation, and you think about naturalization as this indicator for integration or assimilation, then these people come back and of course they can vote in the next elections because they are Mexican nationals. So you would think, okay, political participation, it's done, checked. But when you look at, I don't know, language, for example, integration, sometimes, they know Spanish, but maybe their vocabulary is not for like a working environment, or maybe they have to go through all these processes for like revalidating their credentials. So then it gets a little bit more complicated, right? And I guess like the theoretical frameworks that we have used for studying assimilation, like segmented, classical transnationalism, do not really fit. So that's something we do discuss in the book. For economic integration, we do know that it has changed over time. It has become more difficult. It depends on where you come back to. So we're discussing Mexico City, but the northern area would be kind of like better at this work that I did with Nicole. So I think that when you think about the different dimensions, I think there's something interesting to look at in these different areas for theorizing what it means to actually come back, right? Rather than just saying, okay, yeah, they participate in the election, so they're integrated politically. It's not as easy as that. I'll leave it there for the next question, but it's in the conclusion section. This discussion of theories.
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. Very interesting. I wanted to ask if you heard or any interactions with this policy help the mass returnees, or if you think any government intervention could help with some of these problems, like free certification, translations, yeah, help with documentation.
So the last chapter, as I said, includes these discussions on what they think their lives could, how their lives could improve, and some of them do involve governments and some don't, right? Some involve policies and programs, or even the work of organizations. But I think that there has been lots of things have been done in terms of documents, and there was a lot of discussion around it. So whether accessing the electoral, like the voting ID, how you could facilitate that. And I think one of the things that we discuss in the book, but then also the returnees tell us, is that the Mexican government has really focused on the first few days upon arrival of providing kind of like urgent support. And now it used to be like $10, now it's like 100. And then like providing a bus ticket to your community of origin. And I think in general, even from the words of the returnees, this is not enough. Like we know, like theoretically, it's a long-term process, right? Integration, adaptation just take time. And I think the government has really put this focus first on the documentation, on releasing some documentation requirements like the apostilla, the translation. But something that they say is like, okay, we need to go beyond, right? And something very interesting is that for a while, the Mexican government was asking for the constancia de repatriación, or just like a kind of like a deportation, oh my God, like a paper that says, yes, you were deported. But by definition, this would exclude, first of all the family members of the de facto deportees that were joining the person who was deported. But then it was also excluding, by definition, all the other ones that decided to come back for other reasons, for health reasons, or because they, a family member was very sick, or other reasons, right? So I think that some of the discussions in Mexico right now is also that are also around how to create these programs without excluding, by definition, others that may come back for different reasons.
A number of the people we spoke to benefited from small loan programs. So the small loan programs that two different organizations that deported people who banded together benefited, like were able to translate into buying equipment to make printing kinds of things. And this provided at least a minimal form of activity and sustenance. So,
yeah. And we also include a discussion in the book in terms of how the programs and the policies change over time. So many of the things that we discussed that were available in 2019 are not there anymore. And the organizational landscape has also changed over time. So kind of like this support has also changed over time in the city.
Who I see a hand, and I have someone on Zoom as well. Do you want to go ahead and then?
Yeah. Thank you so much for your work and also for the talk. I really appreciate the way that you complicate the understanding around voluntary and forced return migration. And also how you point out that the policy track doesn't just end it when the people cross back to Mexico, but rather it's extended. And in that way, it's complicated understanding of citizenship and how that doesn't belong. Citizenship isn't defined to just legal mean. The question that I have two questions. One is, I think you mentioned about returnee being, there's certain stigmatization that's attached to returnees living in Mexico City. And so I'm wondering how do people develop a network of support with and inspire that level of stigmatization? And the second is, I think you briefly mentioned how a lot of women, because of their lack of documentations, have to rely on informal economic system to make a living and to survive in Mexico City. And I've seen that in a lot of Vietnamese refugee community in the US, and that economic system is driven by the fact that there's this longing for things that are familiar, longing for sense of home and the taste or the flavors of home. And so women with leveraging in the fact that there's not a lot of available food or things that remind people of that. So I wonder how that is different with the economic, the informal economic system that women are creating in Mexico City, given that now that they are actually at home. Yeah.
So I was thinking of Lucia.
Yeah, talk about it.
So the idea of stigma was like everybody knew about it, and we're kind of reacting to it, as opposed to it didn't come about in our interviews that we didn't observe it, and neither did the interviewees. They sometimes speculated in what they recounted to us. So they sometimes speculated that perhaps someone had mistreated them because they were a returnee. But it was more that everyone talked about the fact that there are certain returnees who are criminal affiliated or gang affiliated. And so for instance, and they differentiated themselves from those people. And you know, that it was sort of it felt a bit like there was a real effort in the interview to kind of say, yes, maybe that there is this belief about, but it's not true, or it's not me. So that's how I saw it coming about. And within the community of activists who we interviewed, a couple of who were kind of involved in organizations that were ground up, organizations for and by people who've been deported. There was a lot of infighting for resources and for political attention. And one of the kind of sources of legitimacy within those conflicts was your deportation and the extent of detention or incarceration that you'd experienced, and kind of some of the hardships that gave you more legitimacy. And so there was a lot of attacking or questioning of one another's stories of deportation. And so that kind of turned the traditional idea of associating deportation with some kind of stigma on its head, at least in that search subcontext.
And I mean, just two things. So we had some extra slides with some quotes, but we don't need to share it. I'm just going to read something that Evaristo also said. From first Julio. So Julio is this like young 26-year-old person I talked about, had like this discussion about like he thought he would make it and he didn't, right? So it says, here in Mexico, sometimes the people talk about the phenomenon, return migration, and it becomes generalized. The term dreamers is complex. We need to start making distinctions. There are also other young people who are looking for a dream that they did not have there in the United States. Sometimes the phenomenon is referred to as repatriation in the Mexican context, and it is not the same. All this creates so many stigmas. This distinction must be made not to hurt the communities. And actually at the end of the book, we discuss a lot about how, for us, it was interesting and difficult to talk about the challenges that they faced and kind of like these negative, environments and adverse stories, stories of like all the adversity. But at the same time, there was freedom. They already had like in some ways made their lives in, and so it was kind of like weird that as Erin said, there were many organizations that were trying to make this population more visible, and we discussed how we should make visible the challenges without creating harm to these communities or even more stigma. So it's not true that everyone is a criminal or was like. But for some employers, maybe they say like, oh, like if you had an irregular status in the U.S., or if you were deported, then maybe you did something wrong, right? And I think it's true that the concepts matter and the terms that we use matter. So as I said, like before Mexican government was asking for constancia de repatriación, assuming that every returnee was a deportee. But then there's people that come back for other reasons. And Evaristo actually had another interesting quote. So he says, in Mexico, the dreamers are very few. Some organizations refer to dreamers like those who are young. Me as an adult, I can also be a dreamer because I do not need to be 18 or 20 to dream. At my age, I was a dreamer and dreamed to make more good things for my family, and you can achieve many things by dreaming. Here, many people think dreamers is young person, but no, we are all dreamers. And I think this was important also for us to understand in terms of how even the discussions about DACA and about like dreamers in the US also shape the ways we think about the returnee population back in Mexico.
Thank you. So we have a question online from Juan Gabriel Loprera. Are you there, Juan Gabriel? So I'll go ahead and read it. It says, after returning, did any of them have plans to migrate to the US again, or did they already feel settled in Mexico?
I can do it. This is something that was actually pending because we were actually formally analyzing for another piece, kind of like the re-immigration plans. I have to say, many would like to come and visit, of course. If they left family, they would come and visit. Yes, maybe are aware. Many, so especially the deported, are aware of the 10-year ban if they were deported. If they not, they're all aware of the policy track. What's interesting is that our sample is relatively old, I guess, but just reflecting how Mexican migrants have settled in the US. So many do talk about how difficult it would be for them to enter the US irregularly, being 50-55, let's say. So they do say, I'm not going to go back if I don't have access to legal documents. So what some people we talk to have US-born children, and they would love to come back with their children to actually, make them know the country they were born and visit. We have to think that we interview them in Mexico City. They're returnees. So we are not looking at those who emigrated, who left back. Of course, people do re-emigrate. Other work with Erin, we do talk, we have studied like the intentions to reunite with the family. But we didn't interview these people, right? What's interesting was that over time, we did learn that someone we talked to actually tried to come back to the US and had a very bad experience in the border due to like violence from the cartels. And he actually didn't cross to the US.
But what was interesting about that particular case is that in our interview with that person, they told us that they had no intention of re-entering without documents. And so I think that in an interview and aware of, what people understand of the legal consequences of re-entry, it's unlikely that you are going to share those plans if you have them. That's one possibility. I also think that people don't always their plans are suddenly forming in their mind. And this certainly did come up in talking about their first migrations.
Yeah.
Many people, it hadn't been something that they had planned in the way that you might think about, putting money and different kinds of plans in place to make a trip, but rather a sudden opportunity that was jumped on.
Yeah, and I think plans today compared to 2019, I'm sure changed, right? Especially under the current environment.
But it did strike me as like, as someone who had read the literature to mean that Border Patrol hadn't been very effective. I don't know. Others, have you read the literature from the 90s and the first decade of the 21st century really was written to suggest that people still were not deterred by border prevention through deterrence. And this is not what came across in our interviews. That their experience of crossing the border in that context was extremely deterring from a second trip. Although many took multiple trips on their first attempt, they didn't want to do that again. They didn't want to. Yeah. And it wasn't just the money, it was the literal experience of how hard it is to cross.
And we didn't see much circularity, right? I think this is also part of the Mexico over between 1990 and 2000. So circularity by then was kind of like limited compared to the 60s or 70s, right? So we didn't see much, I think, discussion of re-immigration and going back and forth that you would expect from like transnationalism literature, because they were not engaged in going back.
Once I clarify, the people once is deported from US to Mexico, is there a possibility for them to come back to get some legal visa to come back, or there's restriction?
It's very hard. So we only have about 3 minutes left, and I just wanted to ask, I feel a lot of people on both sides of the border are bracing for sort of a mass return to Mexico, both in some continuum between forced and voluntary, right? Some deportation, some exit from the U.S. Under duress. What do you think? Yeah, I mean, having written this book and having thought about this, sort of, how would you advise the Mexican government, NGOs in Mexico, anybody who's sort of trying to think about how, or even those on the U.S. side preparing to return? What should people be thinking about and knowing what you know from this book? What do you think your advice would be?
I mean, I think one thing is the importance of documentation, and so both for individuals, gathering that, preparing in that way, school records and employment records and other sorts of certificates and documents of citizenship, and et cetera. And then I think that the U.S. and Mexican government can, or non-governmental organizations could help with credentializing U.S. work experience. So, there was a kind of economic policy term that they used at the Migration Policy Institute for this. I'm forgetting, but anyway, it's like a thing where you take a person's work experience and you translate what that is into into a document that can be read by an employer the same way that, like a CV, I suppose, but it's or I can't read your experience, or I can't validate your experience that are happening in the labor market.
But I think in general, I think planning would help, and like this is what Casarino's theoretical piece would say, right? That if you're prepared to come back with different types of resources, then you would have a better experience upon return. And I think, of course, the policy trap will be there, but I think this goes beyond like policy. I think it's kind of like surrealist trauma or dilemma. I don't know, like we need to go back to therapy in many ways, because, and this is something I've said before, because we always say 1/10 of our population lives in the US, abroad. We are like an immigrant country. Everybody says they have a family member in the US. Everybody says that they haven't seen them for many, many years. But then when you tell people, okay, would you be open to actually receiving them, or like, are you aware that many are deported, they come here, they feel this disconnection for support, even if they're very kind of like, there are many Mexicans are super solidarious to Central Americans, transit migrants. So in general, there is solidarity, but there seems to be a disconnect, and there is not a lot of solidarity. So when in the beginning of the second administration, I remember I went to TV and they were like, give me like a 1 minute, like what would you recommend? And I was like, well, like honestly, I think that people in Mexico should tell all the US family members, all the members that they have in the US, you would be welcomed here. Mm-hmm. And if everyone says, yes, we'll welcome you, you can come to our place, we haven't seen you in 25 years, but you can stay here and you'll start over again, then that will be the change. And then like everybody was like, that's super naive, that's super like, like, what are you thinking? And I was like, come on, it's very sad. Like we have a case of someone who sent remittances to the kids. The kids are adults, they finished school, university, they graduated, And then the father is back and they're like, why are you back? We wanted you to send us money. And I think this is like the whole dilemma of why Mexicans are like fine and happy with family members in the US, but not happy when they are back. And I think this talks to a different like recommendation that is not necessarily having a new program.
But speaking of mental health services, in that case, that father felt that way, that he felt alienated from his family, having lived far away from them for so long. He doesn't know how, and we didn't talk to the kids about how they felt about that, but it is very hard to experience separation. And it came up time and time again that mental health services available to people who've gone through these kinds of experiences that are, well-funded and long lasting would help.
Yeah.
Okay, we are out of time. Thank you so much for your talk. Thank you to those attending in Zoom as well as in the room.
Thank you for inviting us. For hosting
And thanks to the Zoom participants for attending.
and all of the centers for putting